Hi, JohnA.D. I wanted to put together some videos and start releasing them under this title, Walking in the Light. We're going to go down into more of the context of the book of where this term was phrased or coined, and talk about John, who wrote the book, and also the primary context. So this term, the phrase walking in the light, was coined in the book of 1 John. This book was written by the Apostle John, the same author who wrote the Gospel of John, and one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus the Christ. Around the time this book was written, roughly 90 to 100 AD, John was already a very old man, and John was the only original apostle to die of natural causes, dying around the age of 93 or 94. So all the books contained in the New Testament, with the exception of the 4 Gospels, are actually letters that were written for specific people or churches. And I know that kind of goes without saying, but I think sometimes we can kind of just look at the Bible and not understand that there is actually a reason for these letters. So I wanted to just put that out there. And I also find it fascinating doing research on some of the deeper historical context behind the writings of these letters. And this is really what I wanted to talk about regarding the book of 1 John. So why was this book written? If you take a look at the historical backdrop, the reasons for John writing this letter are very self-apparent, especially if you lived around this time and were a Christian. So this letter was written as a warning against a false religion and belief system trying to creep into the church, commonly known as Gnosticism, or as John refers to it as the spirit of Antichrist. Now, many of you may not know what Gnosticism is. I wasn't as familiar with it as I am now. I was more familiar with the belief system than the title. And I'd always encourage you to do your own research online, but I'll go ahead and try to paraphrase it in the basis of the belief system in more modern terms. And I think you'll start to recognize certain outlooks and similarities in a lot of belief systems that we have today. In fact, a lot of this has been repackaged or renamed, and we see a lot of the similarities in New Age teachings, in more inclusionary belief systems like universalism, and even some modern day so-called Christian theologies. So Gnosticism teaches that God's character is undefinable, is unknowable, and ambiguous, that God's attributes are both good and evil, that God is darkness and light, and that God is basically fluid and unknowable. The main issue that these belief systems take with biblical Christianity, or what at the time the apostles or John was teaching, is Jesus Christ and his claim that he is the only begotten Son of God and the only way to God. Now, because Jesus, by his own words, what he said is, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And he made a lot more comparative, where he compared himself to God, the Father, written and captured in the Gospels. So you can see that this belief system, as New Age and Universalism teaches, must keep God. It's got to keep God's character and attributes undefinable, because if they let the Bible and the books therein contained in the Bible define God, then this means that things that God hates are also definable and also knowable. And the things that God hates are defined as things that God hates in the Bible as sin. So to keep an inclusionary doctrine, you can't really make anyone uncomfortable. That's the real reason for these types of doctrines, and that's the reason that they must deny Jesus of Nazareth, which is denying that God came in the flesh. And this is the reason that John states, I'm going to read out of 1 John, where he states in chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, he says, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets or false teachers are gone out into the world. Hereby you know the Spirit of God." He says every spirit, again, he's contrasting a spirit with a man. Anytime he says a spirit, there's always a man involved, or vice versa. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God. So Gnosticism undermines the teachings of the original apostles, and that scripture that I just wrote, we'll put the scripture in there. It was 1 John 4, 1 1 and 2. So back to the what Gnosticism teaches. It teaches against the original apostles' doctrines. And so why all this confusion? Why all this confusion regarding God's apostles? You know, if you were living back in the time and you knew that these guys walked with Jesus, why wouldn't you listen to them? Right? Because they were eyewitnesses. They're the ones who knew him. So there should be no reason, at least on the base level, not to listen to these guys, these apostles. So there's a couple main reasons why certain Jewish and Christian sects began teaching this heresy in the late 1st century AD. There's always the malevolent version explanation where they were doing it on purpose just to deceive people, or there's the other version where they just did it out of ignorance, or because they desired to be relevant. They desired to be teachers themselves and wanted to be held in that position. But bottom line is they obviously did not follow the original apostles' doctrines. So these false teachers had to separate themselves from the apostles because even though they knew that the apostles were with Jesus, they didn't like the Jesus that these guys represented or talked about. They wanted to keep the title, the name, Jesus or Christianity, but change the attributes and form another Jesus after their own image, which is really the sin of many churches today, where that when they don't teach the whole gospel, they don't teach like what the apostles taught. So John states in 1 John 2, 18 and 19, "Little children, it is the last time, and as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now there are many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time. They went out from us, but they were not of us." So he's separating, making a distinction. Like these guys that are teaching this, Gnosticism, are teaching that Jesus never came in the flesh and that he wasn't the Son of God. They went out from us, but they weren't of us. We're not putting our stamp of approval on these guys because they're not teaching what they're supposed to be teaching. So he said, for if they had been of us, they would have no doubt continued with us, but they went out that they might be made manifest, that they were not all of us. And that's 1 John 2, 18 and 19. So true Christianity teaches that God's character is knowable and expressed throughout the Old and New Testament in and through the lives of many believers who, although they lived in different periods, they identified the God of Israel as the one true God. You know, why all this comparative language? That's where a lot of believers or novices get in trouble, is when they try to understand God primarily through the Old Testament text, not understanding the reasons that God did certain things and historical reasons and just the time periods that people lived in. It's amazing to me today that we live in the 21st century, that we can even look back 100 years ago and criticize some of the decisions people made. You weren't living in that time. You didn't have to deal with the kind of circumstances that they had to deal with. But, I'm not going to go down that path. So anyways, one of the reasons, if we're going to go back and with this issue of only looking primarily in the Old Testament, that God did certain things. One of the issues that people don't understand is the way that the Hebrew language works. The Old Testament was translated out of Hebrew, and the New Testament out of Greek. So if we can pick on one thing about the ancient Hebrew language, is God's name. The name that's used for God in a lot of I've heard a lot of Gnostics and Universalists. They'll take this and they'll try to use this as a main point, because the same name used in Hebrew a lot of times for God is used for angels and spirits. It's very similar or the same. And the reason for this, it's actually very simple if you're willing to seek out the truth. Ancient Hebrew is a picture-oriented language. It's a picture-oriented language. And the terms for spiritual entities are based on where the entity resides. So things that are ethereal, meaning things you can't see with your natural eyes, like God and spirits, they were commonly referred to by realm-related terminology. So this is why even in the Old Testament, how God defined himself or separated himself from other gods of other nations was by his attributes. He had to tag along characteristics and attributes. This is where you get certain terminology about God's name, where he says he's the God of Israel, And then he defined himself by tagging along some of these characteristics and attributes. You get phrases like the one true God, the God above all other gods. I mean, why say that if you're not comparing yourself up against anything else? He had to define himself and separate himself by his attributes. So it's God's character that separates him. So this brings us back to the central point of this video, and hopefully this is not too long, but what is the main reason that people have such a hard time accepting and acknowledging Jesus of Nazareth, the historical figure, as the Son of God? Because this is a big issue now. Even many modern day churches and so-called Christians, they're being swayed off into this more universalistic belief. And the problem with that is you're starting to create Jesus, another Jesus. You're starting to form a different Jesus out of characteristics that make you feel comfortable. Only taking characteristics that make you, but it's not what the original apostles wrote. It's not what they said about Jesus. And as we get further in this video, we're going to see that the main reason or the main claim to John's credentials was the fact that he was an eyewitness, and he says that in the very first verses of this book. So it's because Jesus embodied the character and attributes of God his Father. His character and his attributes were well noted and written about in eyewitness testimony given in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as in other books written by the apostles like Peter, John, James, and even Paul. So throughout this message and other messages, I'll commonly make reference to historical sources. It's important to know that all of these men who lived a couple thousand years ago can all be traced through historical data. You can trace them. So one of the things is, did you know that there is actually historical and archaeological evidence that the man, Jesus of Nazareth, existed? Really, until I started doing research on this stuff, I just kind of took it for granted. I kind of just said, you have to believe that he's the Son of God. But first off, you especially for non-believers, you have to believe the guy existed. And a lot of times you'll get this rhetoric either by people who don't believe or more universalistic, where they'll say, oh yeah, the guy was a good guy, and maybe he didn't even exist for real. But that's the main thing that you have to know, that God came in the flesh, that he was God. And again, the reason why people have such a hard problem with it is because Jesus' characteristics and attributes are defined in the Gospels. So you might say, well, what does this have to do with what I'm talking about? So the book of 1 John, here's John's biggest claim to truth in this book. It was the fact that he was an eyewitness of Jesus Christ. And this is why he states in the very first verses the following. I'm going to read the verses from 1 John, verse 1. He says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled, the word of life. For the life was manifested, and he's talking about Jesus in his godhood before he was manifested in the flesh. So this is what he says here. For the life was manifested, and we have seen it, and bear witness, and show unto you that eternal life, which was with the Father, and was manifest unto us. That which we have seen and declare and heard, declare we unto you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with God, is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. So right there, in the very first three verses, John wants to make it crystal clear who he is and his legitimacy as one of the original apostles of Jesus Christ. So here's our evidence. John's eyewitness testimony, first off, that's his credentials. Historical evidence, as we just described, beginning in the first, and John 1 addresses this truth. There's archaeological evidence. The books of the Old Testament were written approximately 1400 BC to 400 BC, and the books of the New Testament were written approximately 40 AD to 90 AD. So anywhere between 3,400 and 1,900 years have passed since any book of the Bible was written. Then we have the science of textual criticism through unbiased document scholars, and you can look, that term up online as well. And also, I always encourage you to do your own research. I did research and found all this stuff. It's pretty easy to find, and a lot of even atheist scholars, or as long as they're unbiased scholars, will admit that all this information is out there and available. So, they'll admit the guy existed. They just don't admit that he he's who he said he was. Going back to, I got off a little bit. So the science of textual criticism through unbiased document scholars. So what this does is this compares manuscripts as were written or copied at different times in history up against even more recent copies. Unbiased document scholars will agree that the Bible has remarkably been well preserved over the centuries. In fact, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, and I had known about this before, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which they were the scrolls found in clay pots, and they dated all the way back to the time of Jesus and before, letters and books that you find from the Old Testament. When they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, scholars were actually shocked to see how similar newer translations were to ancient manuscripts that dated back to the 3rd century AD. In fact, in 2,000 years, over 99% of the original texts have remained intact. And I'll leave the link in the description below. And all of this evidence on historical and archaeological, I'll make sure to leave the links below. So now we're going to go to the archaeological evidence. For a long time, one of the biggest counter arguments, especially by atheists and universalists, is that the Bible and the books in the Bible, they were written so long ago that they've been tampered with and mistranslated. And originally, over a couple thousand years ago. So Gnostics, atheists, and universalists, they'll use this argument. It's actually a weak argument, either knowingly or out of ignorance, to try and undermine the archaeological evidence that points to the authenticity of the Bible and the letters of the apostles. So just remember, especially if you're a Christian, how to undermine a truth is not by disproving all of the facts. It's simply done by creating reasonable doubt, and this is exactly how a good defense attorney works. If you've ever watched crime documentaries, I like watching crime documentaries, you'll see that this is what happens all the time. So a good defense attorney knows that they don't need to prove their client's innocence. All they have to do is poke enough holes in the prosecution's case to create a reasonable doubt and hopefully get a hung jury, and then their client walks free. So in this case, what that argument sounds like is this: the books contained in the Bible were written so long ago, and they've passed through so many hands that they've been corrupted, they've been altered, edited, or revised, or tampered with. And again, this statement, sadly, is enough to push some Christians off of their foundation. So then the historical evidence of the physical existence of Jesus of Nazareth, the man. Again, a lot of people don't even believe that the guy existed. And there's so much evidence out there now. I wasn't even that familiar with it until I did some research the last year or two ago. So there's historical evidence outside of Christian sources or writings, although they should be considered as well. But so we're not saying, hey, we're being biased, and of course we're going to say this guy existed when there's no other evidence to back that up, but there is. So this evidence can be found in classical sources that validate the existence of Jesus the man, such as ancient Jewish texts. And remember, Jesus was considered a heretic by most Jewish leadership. That's representing their political, religious sectors, as well as historians and scholars. So these guys didn't have a lot of nice things to say about Jesus, but at least they wrote about him, right? So at least you know that he was around. There's also Greco-Roman text and beyond that write about the existence of the man Jesus of Nazareth. I'll make sure to include all of the information in the description of this video. And one of the most noted in the Greco-Roman is the Roman senator Tacitus, that wrote about Jesus of Nazareth being crucified as a criminal under the reign of Pontius Pilate. And it gets more detailed than that, but the evidence is out there, and most people will agree, unless they're just in denial and don't want to believe that this guy actually existed. So there's historical evidence of the original apostles, that they existed, their lives and their deaths, including Saul of Tarsus, a Roman citizen that later was called Paul the Apostle Paul. So coming to the end of this introduction, I want to make a final summarized point, and that if the evidence proves a historical Jesus of Nazareth, okay, this is the final point. This is the main point. If the evidence proves a historical Jesus of Nazareth existed, and his apostles existed. And you can connect them both in history. And that Jesus put his stamp of approval on his apostles, and that the letters his apostles wrote have not been changed over a couple thousand years. In order for you not to believe what John is saying, you'd have to say that he's lying or that he's a liar. And that you'd also have to say that the historical figure Jesus of Nazareth is a liar. So this is going to be the end of this message. I'm going to have several along these lines, walking in the light. We'll eventually get to the main, that phrase, walking in light, what that means. But I wanted to create a backdrop for what was going on historically, what John was up against, and the beginnings of Gnosticism, which really has been repackaged, which we've come to know is very similar teachings under New Age, universalism, and more inclusionary so-called Christian theologies.